what's really interesting about botanicals is that I like to think of them as teachers in the sense that we can learn about new pathways or discover new pathways, perhaps to targeting these diseases and develop new treatments for these diseases based on how these botanicals work.
Welcome to the Learn Skin podcast with me, Dr. Raja.
And me, Dr. Hadar, where we discuss all things skin.
Join us as we delve into the art and science of skin health in today's episode.
Hey, Raja, can you say the thing I told you to tell them?
Of course. We are board-certified dermatologists. This podcast is meant for educational and informational purposes only and is not considered medical advice, nor does it serve as a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. All opinions shared do not express the views of Learn Health, Inc. Let's get to the good stuff.
Hey, Raja, how are you today?
Hey, Hadar, I'm kind of feeling in a hunting mood, but gosh darn it, I'm vegan. So what do we do about this?
Well, maybe you should hunt for some plants, my friend, because guess what? Plants are all around us. They're part of everything we do. And when it comes to skin, my gosh, there's so many different applications, but we are just scratching the surface with that stuff. And I think what we want to have...
Puns are endless here.
I know. And I think what we need to do is get a hunter who actually knows how to hunt for plants. And I'm telling you, I know just the right person. Super unique, maybe one of a kind. Would you introduce our mystery guest?
Absolutely. So we have someone who's written a book called The Plant Hunter. She'll tell us more about that, but enough said right there. We have Dr. Cassandra Quave, and she's the curator of the Herbarium and associate professor of dermatology and human health at Emory University. She's been a previous speaker with us at the Integrative Dermatology Symposium. We love your approach to plants. Cassie, welcome to the podcast.
Hey guys, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yes, welcome. And, I want to start off by just your title. It's kind of strange to have a PhD in botany, right? As part of the dermatology department. I think it's an interesting path. How did you end up there?
That is super unique. First of all, how many other departments have a PhD botanist in their department? I venture to guess probably between 0 and 1, but maybe I'm wrong.
And 0 and 1.
That's right. I'm one of a kind. No, I'm technically an ethnobotanist too, which adds an extra layer of complexity. That means a person who studies the ways that people use plants. So that's kind of interesting for a germ department.
Super cool. So you want to tell us maybe in a couple of sentences about your path? Because I think it's very interesting how you ended up doing what you do right now.
Yeah, so I did my PhD in biology, and I was really interested in the ways that people use plants topically to treat a variety of infectious and inflammatory skin diseases. And so I did my graduate work studying traditional medicines used in the Mediterranean and found a lot of really interesting plant practices, brought those plants back to the lab, and studied their impact on the human skin microbiome. And that kind of laid the foundation for the work that I do still today in discovering novel compounds from plants that can help to mitigate the severity of various dermatologic conditions.
So I think the question that is warranted here is, why is it important to study these botanicals when it comes to skin health?
Well, I think it's important to look at medicine from the long view, right? When we think about the age of antibiotics, we're talking about less than 100 years. But well, long before we ever had antibiotics or many of our modern pharmaceuticals, people relied on ingredients from nature to treat all sorts of different diseases. We have around 374,000 species of plants on Earth. And what's astonishing to me is that over 34,000, or that's roughly 9% of all plant life on Earth, has been used in some way by humans to treat diseases. And many of those applications happen to also be for the treatment of skin disease with these topical applications of various botanicals.
It's funny, Cassie. I venture to guess probably many more have been attempted to be used, but somewhere along the way we decided, nope, that's not going to work. So when it comes to botanicals, talk about this a little bit because, my view on this has been a botanical is not a botanical is not a botanical because you got to look at those compositional phytochemicals. Can you tell us a little bit about how do botanicals differ and why is it so important that we're researching these?
Yeah, well, it's just like your spice cabinet, right? If you smell each of those spices in your spice cabinet, they each have a distinct aroma, a different flavor, and that aroma and flavor is due to their chemical makeup. And the same pertains to medicinal plants. They are composed of a unique mixture of different phytochemicals that can act on different targets, either on the body or in some cases also on the microbes that live on your body. And I just think there's, a very long evolutionary context at play here. And what's really exciting about science today is that we're just now really beginning to read the language of nature and understand how many of these botanicals work. And what we're finding is really just incredibly amazing.
So perhaps you can give us a couple examples to help our listeners wrap their head around what we mean. Maybe you can give us an example of a successful transfer that you kind of picked up along the way in your trips around the world, brought to the lab and thought, wow, there's some effect there, and we're able to even bring it to actual use.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So one of my favorite plants is the sweet chestnut, also known as the European chestnut. And historically, the leaves of the chestnut have been used as a poultice to treat inflammatory skin disease. This is the same chestnut, by the way, the same chestnut tree that you eat during the holidays, right? You have chestnuts roasting on an open fire. It's that tree.
Love that stuff.
Yeah.
With some whipped cream.
On open fire,
so tasty.
Creating an extract that you can use on the
So
skin.
tasty.
Love
But
it.
the leaves have been used in the skin. And guess what? We discovered a brand new molecule in the leaves in my lab. And what's fascinating about this molecule is that it acts on staph bacteria, or Staphylococcus aureus, that are associated with disease known as atopic dermatitis, that's more commonly understood as eczema. And what this compound does is it shuts down the ability of these bacteria to produce the toxins that exacerbate the skin flares in eczema. And so this is one example of something that we have documented in the field, brought back to the lab, discovered a new molecule, and also figured out how it works in the skin microbiome, and are now exploring ways to develop this into a new therapy to treat eczema.
Now, Cassie, you talked about research in your lab, and this is super interesting because obviously you're near and dear to research. It's not just something you're reading in, say, PubMed or in manuscripts. That's also important, but you're actually performing it. How do you choose what you're going to study? You're an ethnobotanist. You can pick from anywhere in the world. What grabs your eye and catches your fancy to say, I'm going to study this?
Well, that's a really hard question. There's so many amazing places to work in the world, and it is hard to narrow down and figure out, like, okay, which country are we going to next? Most of my work in the past has focused in the Mediterranean. I've also worked in the Amazon and in the Caribbean and in the United States. This winter, we're actually going to be launching a new expedition in Egypt, in North Africa. But one thing that all these places have in common is that they are considered to be biodiversity hotspots. So these are locations where you have incredibly rich numbers of unique plants that are only found in those parts of the world and nowhere else. And those plants also happen to be at threat. So we're trying to really hit those ecosystems where you have the greatest diversity, but also that diversity is in danger.
That's amazing. And I kind of want to join your travel expeditions every time you go. So please save me a seat.
Yeah, no kidding, Hadar. Yeah, Hadar's already.
I got a little bit of Arabic on me, you know.
Yeah.
I'll go to Egypt, no problem.
I need to practice. All I remember is Yalla, let's go.
That's exactly it. So I want to ask you, because you were giving the example with the sweet chestnut leaves, and maybe it brings up a broader question. In general, what are the advantages of using botanicals in inflammatory skin disease? You gave the example of atopic dermatitis or infectious disease. Why not just go with antibiotics or the topical steroids that we use? Are there any unique advantages to going with that approach?
Well, I think there are advantages and disadvantages to our current medications. I mean, both with antibiotics and with topical steroids. And I think that what's really interesting about botanicals is that I like to think of them as teachers, in the sense that we can learn about new pathways or discover new pathways, perhaps to targeting these diseases and develop new treatments for these diseases based on how these botanicals work. So I think that, there's still a lot for us to uncover, not just in terms of new chemistries, but also in terms of new possible ways of tackling these really important medical problems.
And I know some of the disadvantages of using botanicals is that instability of the product and the process and how you source it. How do you overcome that? And that speaks a little bit to that, maybe this kind of merge that we can do between science and nature and kind of learn from nature and then bring it to the lab and maybe even manufacture it in a way.
Yeah.
So how do you overcome that? Do you think we should just learn what it is and pluck it out of the plant and make the molecule? Aren't we losing some of the synergism of the plant source itself?
Oh man, this is such a hard question because there really are two paths.
Only hard questions here. Only hard questions, Cassie.
They're really...
We get you for a short amount of time. We packed all the hard questions.
All the tough ones. Okay. I'll give you two answers for this one very difficult question. Okay, so answer one.
Go.
In some cases, your active compounds are present in very low percentages. Like that new compound I just talked about from chestnut is like present at the level of like 0.01 something percent yield of the actual leaf weight. So it's a tiny bit, right? But at the same time, what's exciting about that is we've got the molecular blueprints now. And I was just at a conference last week, actually, with a bunch of natural products chemists who delight in building complex natural products based off of those blueprints. And so the hard part is really finding those blueprints to compounds that work. And now with new synthesis techniques or semi-synthesis techniques, we can make those in a pharmaceutical setting. So that's answer one. Now, the weakness to answer one, of course, is, as you mentioned, when you're taking a single compound, you may have issues that arise due to drug resistance, or perhaps they're not going to be as effective as that incredible synergy of mixing multiple compounds that are naturally found in the botanical. And in that scenario, you can develop standardized botanical formulations. There is an FDA approval pathway for this. It's called the Botanical Drug Pathway. Now, the caution mark there, of course, is that only 2 drugs have made it through that pathway, but the pathway exists.
Yeah, that's big.
Yeah, and it exists and perhaps could be a route forward.
You know, Cassie, I still think the standardized extract pathway is still something that a lot more of these supplement companies are taking, because then people can actually know what's in there. You know, one of the criticisms I've heard of standardized extracts, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is that, well, if it's standardized, you're still doing some sort of an extraction. You're still going to modify the original character of the plant. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because I do feel like there's a lot of factors that modify the plant anyway, like the weather, or whether you looked at it wrong, or whether you didn't give it enough water. I mean, I pejoratively talk about looking at it wrong, but there's so many factors that change the composition. How wide of a swing is that truly, you know, those environmental factors?
Well, I think one misperception that people have about plants is that they are static. Just because they stand still, at least to our human eye and our sense of time, doesn't mean that they are static. They are incredibly responsive to their environment. You can have the same species growing on one side of a mountain and then another population of that same species on the other side of the mountain, and you can have vastly different levels of certain compounds produced by those plants because, as you mentioned, because of rainfall or climatic conditions or herbivory that may be happening in one population but not the other, these kinds of evolutionary pressures that occur within a natural environment. So, you know, these plants that are responding to these different cues in nature and communicating with different organisms in nature, because plants, by the way, talk to each other and they talk to other organisms in the wild through the release of these chemical signals. And it's those chemical signals, by the way, that oftentimes end up being interesting medicines for us. So yes, there can be variability, and I think that's why it is important to standardize your botanical products to a certain percentage of scientifically based, scientifically vetted levels of your most bioactive constituents, which is something we can determine today in modern laboratories.
Cassie, I got to ask, how did you end up in a dermatology department? When, you know, I could totally picture you in a botanical department or some sort of plant science department. Kudos to Emory for being forward thinking here, but how did you end up there?
You know, it's funny how these things happen. I've always had a heavy medicine bent. I almost went to med school. I got in and then at the last second decided, no, I'm going to keep flitting off to the Amazon. But at the same time, I've always had this love and passion for medicine. And there are a lot of academic, you know, dermatologists out there that are PhDs working on kind of the skin microbiome, the skin environment, and also kind of just skin pathobiology within dermatology programs. So it's not that unusual to have a PhD in the department, but the whole botany bent is a bit unusual. I think part of the reason is I have a very translational bent to my research, and I really wanted to connect with practitioners that are working with patients every day and to really have a better understanding of what are some of the biggest challenges that we face in the field today and hopefully contribute towards finding solutions for those problems.
Oh my gosh, you said the magic word, Hadar. You remember those shows? I'm not going to mention any of them because some of them actually went down the tank, where you say the magic word and everyone starts yelling. I feel like Cassie just said the magic word, microbiome. Yeah, microbiome. So now we have to ask you a question around that, which is, how are these botanicals influencing the microbiome, and how do you study that? And you just mentioned the chestnut story with Staph aureus, but I'm curious, just more broadly, what's your approach to understanding the influence on the microbiome?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, the microbiome is such a fascinating topic. And when it comes to the skin, it very clearly correlates with different types of diseases, especially when you have an imbalance or an overgrowth of certain species within certain areas of the skin. So when it comes to plants, I mean, I think that in traditional medicine, I've learned that a lot of healers focus on this idea of returning balance to the body. And so a lot of these traditional medicines don't necessarily kill bacteria like an antibiotic would, but instead interfere with their ability to communicate with one another. So I already mentioned that plants communicate with one another and with other organisms in their environment. But guess what? Bacteria and fungi do as well. So they release these signaling molecules into the extracellular environment because on their own, as single cells, bacteria are actually quite weak. It's only through the coordinated action of many that they can cause a lot of damage in the body. And so we've gone down this rabbit hole and have found time and again some really interesting examples of traditional medicines that, instead of acting as antibiotics and killing bacteria, really interfere with their ability to communicate with one another. And what this translates to is, in some cases, it translates to reduced capacity for producing these toxins that just really eat up your skin. I'm like zombie flesh, right? You can turn off the ability of bacteria to do that. And others can interfere with their ability to produce biofilms, which is basically like a slimy fortress that bacteria hide inside of. And so we're learning more and more that how these molecules work. Other examples include our work on the elm leaf blackberry, where we've discovered compounds that stop bacteria from sticking to surfaces. Very important, by the way, in the microbiome of chronic wounds, where you have mixtures of staph and Pseudomonas present. Yeah, and the examples going on. But again, we've only just really started to look at botanicals for the discovery of these types of molecules. And I think there's much more for us to discover still out there.
Cassie, just as a follow-up, you mentioned the ability to, I guess, disrupt quorum sensing and...
you read my mind, Hadar. I was literally going to ask the same question.
Of biofilm. I wanted to ask directly about resistance. So I don't know if you've gotten that far, but just broadly speaking, or maybe you can give specific examples, one of the problems we have across healthcare is the use of antimicrobial and then the almost inevitable resistance that comes to it. The resistance to penicillin was known before penicillin even hit the market. That's how quickly resistance develops. What about botanicals? Is there any hope there that maybe we can avoid that by that unique mechanism?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I'll start with this statement. Anyone that claims that they have a resistant proof antibiotic as a single compound is just, I think, a bit too optimistic. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. I was about to hit the censor button. Okay,
it's
good.
just
Thank
a bit
you.
too optimistic. I mean, now, when you think about these other targets, I can tell you what we've done in the laboratory. We have taken these quorum sensing molecules, these inhibitors of quorum sensing, and have run these through what are known as passaging studies in bacteria, where basically you give a little bit of the drug to the bacteria over and over and over for days on end, reculturing the bacteria to see if they have a shift in their reactivity to that compound. Now, so far with our work in quorum sensing, again, this is in vitro in test tubes, we have not seen resistance emerge, much actually to our dissatisfaction because we were hoping for mutants so that we could sequence them and figure out what the exact target was on the drugs. If you do this with antibiotics, you very quickly start to see resistant mutants emerge. However, I think part of the problem in doing this with quorum sensing inhibitors is that we are not seeing the other selective pressures, such as the immune system, at play when you're doing this in a test tube. So the jury is still out on how resistance proof these types of approaches could be. But one advantage that plants do have is polypharmacology by nature. Plants have
such a great point, Cassie. I love this point.
Yeah, they have hundreds, if not thousands, of unique molecules. And many have found that sometimes these work in synergy. We don't always know exactly which compounds are working in synergy, but I'll give you a really good example. Have you ever heard of the drug artemisinin? Artemisinin is derived from wormwood. The discoverer of artemisinin is a Chinese scientist. Her name is Yu Tu, and she actually won the Nobel Prize a few years ago in physiology or medicine for this discovery. And she isolated this compound from the wormwood, and it has saved millions of people's lives across the planet of malaria. And many different derivatives and generations, next generations of this compound have come out and are used all the time across the globe. Now, one of the biggest challenges is artemisinin resistance in the malaria parasite. Now, others have looked at studies. I'll give you a specific example from Pam Weathers' group, where they've looked at the whole plant extract and have found that that can overcome resistance. Now, I don't believe that the entire mechanism has been worked out, but there's something to be said about using the whole botanical versus an isolated compound, especially when you're placing such a direct selective pressure on an infectious agent. So I think that's a good example of where you may have some advantages in that polypharmacology approach. But still, it's a complex question. It requires a lot of intricate scientific manipulation and study to understand how this works. But I think that, polypharmacology, again, inherent in plants, is an area we should explore further.
I really want to get to the book, but before that, a quick question. So you've been studying plants for such a long time, and here we love to talk about food. So how did all this studying of plants change your diet, if at all? Your personal diet, how you look at food right now? Did it have any effect on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say in our household, we eat more of a Mediterranean diet, so much more heavy in vegetables and complex carbohydrates. I also love fermented foods, which are not so much part of the Mediterranean diet, but I don't know, it's like my brain craves them. And it's interesting because, the more that comes out in the scientific literature around the gut-brain axis and how our bacteria actually have receptors for neurotransmitters that are, signal in the brain. I mean, maybe my gut is telling me to eat more of these compounds because
it's kind of a gut feeling.
I got a gut feeling about this. So I love lacto-fermented foods. I mean, I also love a lot of veggies and pasta and all those good things you can find in the Mediterranean for sure.
Excellent. Well, I think you mentioned earlier how you wanted to come to Emory to connect with practitioners. Well, I want to tell everybody who's listening that you can connect with Cassie if you come to the Integrative Dermatology Symposium. She's going to be there in person. And also, we will have the pleasure not just hearing her speak, but also she'll be around to answer questions specifically about her book, which is called The Plant Hunter. Well, actually, Cassie, let's hear it from you. So tell us about this book. What was the impetus to write it, and what's in it?
Oh, cool. So it's called The Plant Hunter, A Scientist's Quest for Nature's Next Medicines. And it really is a quest. So think of it as my personal odyssey story of how I came to study the plants that I do today. And it really takes you through the path of what it's like to become a scientist. On a more personal note, I also talk about my trajectory as a woman in science and in particular as a disabled woman in science. So I was born with multiple congenital birth defects of my skeletal system that led to the necessity of having my leg amputated when I was young. I also got a horrific deadly staph infection when I was 3 that had to be treated, and I was, following months of hospitalization. And just that experience of what it was like growing up disabled, battling infection, dealing with constant medical concerns, and at the same time finding my passion after this amazing journey to the Amazon, working with a traditional healer and making this decision to spend my life, to dedicate my life to not the practice of medicine, but rather the discovery of new medicines. And so that's really what the book's about. It's a discovery story. It's a travel log. it's a memoir.
That's beautiful. And I got to say, if you guys want to try to keep up with Cassie, I've been hanging out with her. It is impossible. A ball of energy and always fun to talk to.
But she'll be at the IDS.
Yes.
She'll be at the IDS.
Meet me there.
Exactly. We got her. Okay, listen, folks, we got to wrap this up, but I want to take one more second to thank you again, Cassie, for joining us on the podcast. It's always fun talking to you. I've learned so much. I've written a few notes here for myself and should definitely talk about wounds again. But thank you for your time, for your expertise. Looking forward to seeing you again.
Great. Can't wait to see you guys too.
Hey, Raja, do you know where the integrative medicine movement started?
According to Google, since Google knows everything, Dr. Andrew Weil founded the Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona in Tucson back in 1994. Why do you ask?
Well, you know how we always try to get to the root cause? I think we need to go big for the fifth annual Integrative Dermatology Symposium. How about we do this? Let's meet at the Los Ventana Canyon Resort in Tucson, Arizona. Or you can join virtually from September 30th to October 2nd and hear from the world-renowned experts like Andrew Weil.
Exciting. And our theme is connecting mind, body, and spirit to take a more holistic approach to our patient care. What do you say?
Absolutely. I mean, where else can you get the latest on diet and dermatology, hypnosis, botanicals, common diseases, aesthetics, and other unique topics in dermatology with practical takeaways to start using in clinic right away?
So true. And let's not forget, we've got the new track for estheticians too. I think I'm going to need to call in a sick day or two before the symposium so I can enjoy the waterfall and trails on the resort, stargaze, play a round or two of golf or tennis, relax at the spa, and catch up with colleagues at the evening receptions.
Yes, that place is spectacular. You know, use our discount code POD25 at checkout for 25% off.